Great. Our next talk is by Carly Sommerlot, A Tale of Two Nasal Prefixes, Evidence from Desa, Malay Language of West Kalimantan.
Thanks, Mitcho. Yes, so today the focal point of my talk is the nasal prefix that's found in many languages of Indonesia. We just saw a little bit of it in the last talk. And in some languages, we see this nasal prefix in like standard Indonesian as a full mung prefix, but in others like Jakarta Indonesian, we see just this N occurring by itself. And there's some examples here in 1 and 2 of the two languages, standard Indonesian and Jakarta Indonesian. These nasal prefixes are generally analyzed as actor voice morphemes, partially on the basis that they are in complementary distribution with the passive prefix D. So trying to use the nasal prefix in any of these D passives is ungrammatical, as we see in 2 prime. However, there has largely been a lot of different analyses for the nasal prefix and not a lot of consensus over the years. So I've offered a number of the numerous different analyses we've gotten for the nasal prefix on this page here, including a transitive marker and agentive marker, case marking the direct object, antipassive, and more recently having aspectual features. But the consensus has been reached on one feature of the nasal prefix, and that's that it blocks DP movement across it. So in object extraction and A-bar movement, in something in like 3, which we have here, the nasal prefix is going to block extraction over the actual nasal prefix itself, and you can't get the nasal prefix in this object extraction question. So you would have to say apa yang Vera beli as in 3, but you couldn't say 3 prime where you actually have this nasal prefix. This contrasts with a subject question where we don't have any sort of DP moving over the actual verb where you can get the nasal prefix. And this has been used as evidence to show that Indonesian and a lot of related languages have this subjects-only restriction on extraction that we've seen famously in Philippine-type languages going all the way back to Keenan and Comrie in 1977. So in this talk, I'm going to talk about a previously undocumented language of Indonesia. It's called Desa. It's located in West Kalimantan and Borneo. And I'm going to show evidence that these extraction contexts actually show that Desa has 2 nasal prefixes. And I'm going to talk a little bit about these nasal prefixes themselves, their syntactic functions that I'm arguing for, and how this might relate to looking at the nasal prefix in the larger literature on Indonesia in general. So just to start with Desa, since it is previously undocumented, it's spoken in Swatmansi in the Sangha Regency in West Kalimantan, and I've provided a map here if you're not familiar with Borneo. And it is a Malayic language, so it's very closely related to Indonesian and Malay. It does show a lot of similarities with other Malayic languages, and including some basic syntactic features, which I'm going to discuss before we get into actual extraction. So Desa syntax does resemble Indonesian syntax in several ways. It does seem to have canonical subject-verb-word order, subject-verb-object word order, and uses both a nasal prefix and a D prefix, which is used in undergoer-oriented sentences. So this nasal prefix can occur as mung or as just the N, as we see in 5 versus 5 prime. So it's okay to say sidang menanam bunga di taman, they plant flowers in the field, but additionally you can also just say sidang nanam bunga di taman and not have that full nasal prefix on the verb. Undergoer-oriented sentences result in the undergoer moving to the sentence initial position, just like in Indonesian, and the verb takes the prefix D, and the agent occurs in a prepositional phrase headed by ole, and that's shown in 6. And additionally, Desa does seem to have what Hiroki was just talking about, this bare passive, this passive type 2, often referred to as object voice, that we see in 7, which has a slightly different word order than the D passive, but is still considered an undergoer-oriented construction. So now if we consider extraction in languages of Indonesia, I'm going to be talking both about Standard Indonesian and Jakarta Indonesian, because we do see kind of a difference between what the nasal prefix looks like in these 2 languages, in order to consider how Desa behaves the same way as these languages do. So in Standard Indonesian, I've already noted that extraction that results in DP movement over the verb disallows the nasal prefix. And this is true in WH questions. So if we look at object questions in 8, we see that you can have apa yang Vera beli, but you can't have the nasal prefix, like I mentioned above, and this contrasts with subject questions. This additionally is found in other types of A-bar movement, like relative clauses, which we see in 10, with there being no nasal prefix allowed in the object relative clause in 10, but in the subject relative clause you can have the nasal prefix. Furthermore, it's been noted that mung in Indonesian blocks a movement as well, and this explains why D passives cannot take mung, and further explains why the object voice can only take this bare unaffixed in terms of voice morphology verb. So 12 is a perfectly acceptable bare passive in Indonesian, but 12 prime is ungrammatical. So in both a movement and a bar movement in standard Indonesian, if the DP moves over the verb, the nasal prefix cannot occur. So now I'm going to consider extraction in Jakarta, Indonesian. We have a nasal prefix, but it's slightly shorter, so it looks a little bit like maybe partly what we see in Desa, but N does block DP movement in a bar movement in Jakarta, Indonesian, just like standard Indonesian. So if we look again at WH questions, we see an object question in 13 cannot take the nasal prefix. It results in the ungrammatical form in 13 prime. But in subject questions, it's perfectly acceptable. And again, like standard Indonesian, this occurs in relative clauses as well, as we see in 15 and 16. Object voice in Jakarta, Indonesian additionally cannot occur with a nasal prefix, suggesting that it also blocks a movement, the same pattern we saw in standard Indonesian. So while 17 is grammatical, 17 prime is not. So now let's go ahead and look at the pattern we see in Desa. Considering all the similarities we've seen with Desa and standard in Jakarta, Indonesian so far, we might expect that the nasal prefix would pattern identically. And at first glance, it looks like it does. So we have 18, an object question in Desa. This has a bare form of the verb boli, so opai yang inya boli, what did he or she buy? And if we try to add the full nasal prefix here in 18 prime, we get an ungrammatical question. And this contrasts again with the subject question in 19, siapa yang membawa kayu, which who brings wood, perfectly acceptable to have the nasal prefix. And this pattern holds in relative clauses as well. So at this point, it seems that Desa really has the same exact pattern that we see in standard in Jakarta, Indonesian. However, if we consider just the pattern of the N by itself, we get a completely different pattern. So N does not block A-bar movement, as it is acceptable in both subject and object extraction contexts. So if we look in an object question in 22, we have opa yang inya moli, where before we had opa yang inya boli with a bare verb, and now we have added this nasal prefix, but not the full one, just the shortened version. And this is grammatical in Desa. This is also something that can occur in subject questions. So we can have this shortened form of the nasal prefix in a subject question as well. And again, this pattern is not exclusive to just WH questions, is not exclusive to just certain types of verbs, but occurs quite frequently in A-bar movement constructions. So in 25 through 29 here, I've given a variety of object relative clauses, topicalization, as well as other object WH questions to show that this is a very commonly occurring, frequent way to mark these types of constructions. If we look at A movement, where we might expect blocking effects, we see that both prefixes block A movement. Neither are allowed in object voice in Desa. So 30, kayu inya bewa, he brings wood, is grammatical, but either the full nasal prefix or the short nasal prefix results in ungrammaticality. So I've summarized in table 1 here the blocking effects of these nasal prefixes. And we see that we have one prefix that seems to look exactly like standard in Jakarta and Indonesian in what it blocks. And then we have this strange shortened nasal prefix, which has a different pattern in that it only blocks A-bar movement. It only blocks A movement and does not block A-bar movement. So what I'm arguing today is that Desa crucially differs from standard in Jakarta, Indonesian, and having evidence of two separate prefixes. We can't really account for why one would block extraction if we don't look at these as two separate prefixes that isn't just one is a shortened form of another, but actually have different functions. And I am going to talk about how we can analyze this, considering its completely different pattern from the nasal prefix that we've come to expect in more well-studied languages. So I argue that the two separate prefixes in Desa represent two separate functions in the syntax that are bundled together in standard in Jakarta and Indonesian. Furthermore, this overt morphological representation is actually a realization of the underlying structure in the syntax. So crucially, I'm arguing that while Desa has this split voice projection to account for the two different prefixes that it has, standard Indonesian and Jakarta Indonesian only have one higher verbal projection. The nasal prefix in standard in Jakarta and Indonesian has bundled the functions that we see in the two separate prefixes in Desa. And I provided the structures here for the two different examples. So in Standard and Jakartan Indonesian, we see just this little VP. We see ma or na, depending on the language, is located in the little v, but this contrasts with Desa, where we see a voice P that then has a little VP, and ma is located in voice, and na is located in the little VP. So I'm going to follow some previous analyses of Standard Indonesian. It's very popular to use a phase-based approach, kind of comparing these to Philippine-type languages, which we also have a lot of analyses using a phase-based approach. And I'm going to follow a couple authors, Aldridge, Nomoto, Cole et al., and proposing that Hmong occupies little v, or voice in Cole et al., and lacks an EPP feature, and that prevents an object moving from the edge of the VP phase, thus making it inaccessible to the higher phase. So if we look at 31A compared to 31B, 31A is a grammatical construction without the nasal prefix. We see this null morpheme here in V. It has an EPP feature, and this allows the object to move up and thus be accessible to this higher phase. But in 31B, when we have the nasal prefix, when the nasal prefix is here, it doesn't have the EPP feature, and thus this direct object cannot move up and thus cannot be extracted. Hmong is in complementary distribution with the null prefix, and thus doesn't allow movement when the null prefix does. So I'm suggesting that we extend this analysis to Desa, but there has to be certain modifications, obviously, to take into account the different pattern and the fact that I am arguing that there are two separate prefixes. So I obviously already mentioned that I'm analyzing this as having an extended projection and having a voice P and a little VP. Ma is located in the highest phase, the voice P, and na in V. Ma still lacks an EPP feature, like we see in Standard and Jakartan Indonesian, and is in complementary distribution with a null morpheme. But I am claiming that these have two separate functions. So the shortened N serves to license the external argument and assign accusative case to the direct object. The ma is in voice because it's really just this actor voice morpheme that doesn't have either of these roles. I also argue that ma subcategorizes for N because they always occur together. So 32A and 32B show a little analysis of Desa. So we see it's pretty similar to the Standard Indonesian and Jakartan Indonesian, but does take into account these modifications that are necessary for Desa. So we see this N here is located in little v. It has accusative case. It assigns this to the object and also introduces the external argument. And up here, we have an EPP feature, which allows movement up into its specifier, which is the phase edge. But with ma, same issue as we had in Standard and Jakartan Indonesian. It doesn't have an EPP feature, and thus we can't have any movement up into its specifier. So in regards to why I'm analyzing this N, this shortened nasal prefix, as introducing the external argument and assigning accusative case, I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. This isn't necessarily a new analysis in terms of the nasal prefix in general. Even the Hmong and Standard Indonesian has received similar analyses by a couple authors. I'm arguing that this is only in the N and not the ma. So one piece of evidence from this comes from N's behavior within transitives. If this short nasal prefix both introduces the external argument and assigns accusative case, we really wouldn't expect that it would be able to occur in transitives. And if it only did one of these functions, say introduce the external argument, we might expect that it would occur on unergatives. So I've given a sampling of unergative and unaccusative verbs in Desa. And in unaccusatives, we see basically no morphology at all. And in unergatives, we typically see a b morpheme, which looks a lot like the bur in Indonesian. Unergatives often take b, and there's a few verbs that look like they could have a nasal prefix. These are verbs like nari, to dance, and nangis. However, these are likely borrowings as they occur quite often in languages across Borneo and Indonesian in general, and it doesn't seem to be a productive use of the nasal prefix. Instead, we almost always see b. There is one environment in which some unaccusative verbs can take a nasal prefix. So if we look at the examples in 33 and 34, in 33a, we have inya jetu, which is he or she falls, and if we add a nasal prefix to that, we get inya nyetu pingan yen, she drops a cup. And this is grammatical, but it's not possible to just add the nasal prefix if we don't additionally have some sort of direct object. So we're seeing a change in valency as well as a change in meaning. Adding the nasal prefix seems to require not only do we now have an agent, someone who's actually doing this action, but we also have a direct object. And this would follow with my analysis of N, because we now are introducing an external argument that has volition, as well as we now have a direct object to assign accusative case. And this is the same for something like tido, sleep as well, which we see in 34a and 34b. There's some further evidence comes from N's function with context where there's a clear volition by the agent. When we say something like 35a, aku losi bejuku, this means I lost my shirt, but it wasn't my fault. I'm not the one who did it. Someone else lost it. There was some reason that it was lost, but none of the fault lies with me. But if we have something like 35b, aku ni losi bejuku, this now becomes something that was my fault. I'm the one who lost the shirt. I dropped it on the way to school. For some reason, I lost my shirt, and it's now my fault. So the addition of the nasal prefix adds a different meaning to it than we had without it. And again, this seems to follow with my analysis. So this has a lot of interesting implications for analyzing the nasal prefix, not only in Desa, but in other languages as well. So I've argued that Desa actually has evidence for two separate nasal prefixes, and that these have two different functions. One key component of my analysis is that in Standard and Jakartan Indonesian, these same functions exist on the nasal prefix, but they're bundled into one instead of being separated into two. I think that this makes sense for why previous authors have had a lot of different ideas for what the nasal prefix actually does, and it's because it does have more functions than what we would expect for just a voice marker. And this could be accounted for by something like Desa, where we obviously have a separate voice morpheme, but then we have another morpheme that is doing these other functions. And if they've been bundled together onto one morpheme in Standard Indonesian, it would be difficult to account for this by just claiming it's a voice marker. So I think this reveals a little bit about what might be happening in Indonesian. There are some interesting considerations to think about if we try to consider where this came from. The Hmong prefix has been reconstructed to Proto-Malayan Polynesian as Mang, and has also been reconstructed to Proto-Malay by Ross. So the question would be, did it split into two prefixes in Desa and then become something in Jakarta Indonesian, or did it stay together in Standard Indonesian and go straight from Proto-Malayan Polynesian Mang to what we see in Jakarta Indonesian? This is kind of interesting that Jakarta Indonesian has this N, the shortened form, but it behaves identically to Hmong in Standard Indonesian. Furthermore, it's been noted by David Gill that most languages in Indonesia, if they have the nasal prefix, really just have the shortened form. So it would be interesting to take a look at these languages and to see if it functions more like what we see in Desa or more like what we see in Standard and Jakarta Indonesian. For instance, I've done fieldwork on a few languages that are part of the Land Dayak family in West Kalimantan, and in these languages, there's an interesting pattern where this nasal prefix, the shortened form, because they don't have the long form, is allowed in undergoer-oriented constructions. So I've given some data from two of these languages, Bae and Ribun in 36 and 37. And we know that these are undergoer-oriented constructions because they have an undergoer, the undergoer voice morpheme occurring, plus the word order indicates this as well. So in 36, we have Diohan Kunako Noro, this house was destroyed by you. And we actually do have a nasal prefix right there in the undergoer voice. And this is true in Ribun as well. This is obviously unexpected if these are voice morphemes. So neither the analysis of the nasal prefix in Standard Indonesian or the one that I've offered today in Desa can really account for the pattern we see in these languages. So it would be interesting to kind of extend to these languages and see what exactly is happening in them as in terms of the nasal prefix as well. So to kind of wrap up, I think one thing that this really reveals is the necessity of including understudied languages in syntactic analysis. There's been a lot of work on the nasal prefix in Standard Indonesian and Jakarta Indonesian, in a very largely spoken, more well-studied languages of Indonesia. But without looking at these understudied languages, we would miss huge generalizations like this, where we see evidence for a completely different function that might tell us a little bit about the nasal prefix in general. So I think it's just another call for more documentation work to be used in syntactic analysis. One remaining question I have in my last 30 seconds is, If there's any difference between the two in active voice constructions, because we do see ma and na occurring in active voice pretty interchangeably. And we do see this type of shortening of the nasal prefix in colloquial Indonesian as well, but they're not separate prefixes. And it has been associated with high transitivity to shorten it. But I haven't found anything like this to be true in Desa. So it could be that there really is no difference in using the voice morpheme ma in active constructions or not. But I need to do a little bit more in-depth analysis of that, probably with more field work. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes for questions. If you have a question, please indicate in the chat or in by the raise hand function if you're familiar with that. So there are a number of questioners. Elena, can you unmute yourself if you have a question?
Hi, thanks, Carly. This is really interesting, and maybe this is a really naive question. How do you get the N to block a movement?
Yes, that's no, it's not a naive question. That's a great question, because there isn't any reason that it would block a movement. I think that you would have to kind of look at an in-depth analysis of what's happening in the object voice for maybe looking at how the actual agent is introduced and if it's introduced in a different way. And the object voice in general, as we saw from Hiroki's talk, often involves like an analysis with ergative case and things like that. So I think there probably is a workaround. I'm not completely confident in how to do it yet, but I think that's a great point.
Okay, Dan, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Carly, for the talk. Really interesting stuff. So I have just kind of like a crazy question here. Like this is just like sort of wild, but so a lot of the examples that just have the bare eng prefix kind of look like a passive semu in, you know, like familiar Indonesian. And so, and the prefix mang, right, is bimorphemic at like some earlier stage, right? So there's a distributive element pang, and then the agent voice infix and then pang or pumang becomes mang, right? So what if the bare nasal prefix, the ng here, is actually just something like pang? Like that's the reflex of pang, and then the mung that we see is the, what I mean is, what if the bare nasal thing is actually a form that is historically and maybe synchronically not even agent voice, and the nasal that we see there is from a morpheme that historically is not an agent voice morpheme, namely the distributive pang. I hope that was clear.
I think so. I think I have a clarification question. So if it's a reflex of pung, what would that implicate that the function is?
I mean, it would implicate that it's not an agent voice morpheme at all.
But is there anything more specific? Like, would it have a specific function?
Well, what did pung do? Pung was like some sort of distributive, like pseudo, like something like an antipassive. I'm not the person to talk about the history of pung.
Yeah.
But,
I mean, that's an interesting idea, and there have been people who have claimed that even mung in Indonesian could be analyzed as an antipassive. So I think that there could be some merit to that. I would have to do a lot more to look into that, but I think that's a really interesting idea.
Can you prefix it with D? Can you have D, eng, something?
No. It's not available in any type of undergo-oriented construction.
Edith Aldridge has a sort of follow-up question, but I don't know if I should read it or...
I can ask it. If you want me to. Can you hear me?
I think it's hard to hear you. You're rather quiet.
Oh, am I? Oh, shoot. You really can't hear me?
I can a little bit. You're pretty quiet, but I think I can hear you.
Oh, heck. All right, I hate this stupid thing. I'm sorry. All right, I'll try to shout. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
All right, so this is just a response to, I had the same question as Elena when I looked at the tree, N32A or something like that. I don't remember. But your analysis of the object movement with the right? So at first I thought, that violates minimality. But then I thought, oh, no, this is really cool because you have an asymmetry between A bar and A movement. So what it looks to me like is, so historically, of course, Austronesian languages have the extraction restriction across the board. So there is no distinction between A and A bar movement because it's just a single feature that's being attracted. And so you get locality restrictions. There isn't a difference between A and A bar movement. But here, it looks like you're developing a split, right, between A and A bar movement, which is, I think, a natural kind of change. And especially, so the way I look at this is that the collapsing of A and A bar properties is because you have a smaller phase, right? So you don't have the split between voice and little VP. You only have one landing site. So then A and A bar movement get conflated. But if you have a higher landing site, the agent can get licensed in a lower position in A movement, then lower argument can move over it. And so this is related. So the growth of the A bar lack of interference from the agent is the result of the growing of this higher phase edge, which you have here. It's a split voice analysis. So I thought that played in really well in accounting for why you do get object movement in A bar movement, but you don't get it in A movement.
Yeah. You explained that so much better than I ever could. But I do think one of the most interesting takeaways is this, asymmetry between the two, particularly because most analyses of A bar movement, the extraction asymmetry in Indonesian, rely on the idea that you passivize first. And so most explanations say, oh, well, the object can be extracted if you go through A movement, you passivize it. But that cannot account for what we see in Desa, which kind of throws into whole question what's going on in extraction. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Paul has had his hand up for a while. If you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Yeah, this is great stuff. Thank you, Carly. Following up on Elena's question also, it would be interesting to compare Desa with Kuching Malay. At the very end of the Cole, Hermon, and Yanti paper, they have a short section on Kuching Malay where the nga nasal prefix doesn't block A bar movement, but also doesn't block A movement. And in fact, you can combine it. You get the D passive with the nasal prefix still attached to the root. So there, it'd be great to figure out why what looks very similar is having this different effect. I also wanted to mention your Landaic examples at the very end of the paper, where you have a passive auxiliary type, where you marked as the UV marker, the underscore voice marker. It's like an auxiliary. And then you have the active voice form, or the nasal prefix form of the verb. That pattern happens all across Central Borneo. A lot of non-Malaic languages have that as well. But in those languages, often the active voice form is not marked with the nasal prefix. Sometimes it's just the bare root. Sometimes it's a different kind of a consonant mutation or something else. So in that construction in Borneo, it doesn't seem to be specific to the prefix, where you get this periphrastic passive or periphrastic undergoer voice. It's this construction of auxiliary plus active voice form, whatever that is, nasal prefix or not.
Okay, that's really interesting, because you do seem to get a nasal prefix in Landaic languages and active voice. But
some Landaic, not always. I mean, and some of them it's there sometimes and sometimes not. It's funny. Up in the Sarawak Landaic, you get mixed patterns.
That's really interesting. Okay.
I think we have time for a quick question from Alex Smith.
Hi. Yeah, this is in relation to something that Dan said earlier about the possibility that in may reflect Pong. And there's a lot of languages in Borneo where when you look at them that have reduced forms of Hmong down to Engma, And in pretty much every case that I've looked at, those languages retain Pong in its original form and its original usage. So I'm not aware of any cases where you have reduction to Engma that clearly come from Pong, because in most of the languages where you have the Engma by itself, Pong still exists in its original form and function.
Okay, that's interesting.